Good evening. Okay. Hello, this is a nice and cozy crowd here. Thank you for joining us. My name is Naomi Slip. I'm the Douglas and Cynthia Crocker Endowed Chair for the Chief Curator and Director of Museum Learning here at the New Bedford Whaling Museum. While we are joining here in person, we do also have a virtual audience attending live on Zoom at the back of the room. So we'll be talking into the mic, and our team at the back is also recording. So hello to our Zoom attendees. Thanks for joining online. So in December of 2021, we at the museum here opened an exhibition called Unvarnished, Conservation of Charles Sidney Raleigh's Panorama of a Whaling Voyage. Now, I should say that title was twofold. It was both a look at a past conservation project that the museum had undertaken in the 1960s, and in a second way, it was aspirational, looking toward the potential for a hoped-for conservation project of the future. The exhibition aimed to tell the story of our second panorama painting, created between 1878 and 1880 by the prolific British-born artist Charles Sidney Raleigh. Now, many museum members will be familiar likely with our almost 1,300-foot-long panorama painting, the Grand Panorama of a Whaling Voyage Round the World, painted by Benjamin Russell and Caleb Purrington around 1848. And that massive painting was conserved and exhibited in 2018. However, we also own a second historic panorama painting, a 275-foot-long painting of 22 whaling scenes following the 1870 to 74 voyage of the ship Niger, one of the last great whaling vessels of the time. Panorama paintings were popular entertainments. They were exhibited to working and middle-class audiences for a small ticket fee, and they rose to prominence in the United States starting in the 1840s. Often accompanied by dramatic music, stage dressing, and narration, both static and moving panorama paintings engaged audiences' imaginations and offered an exciting and sometimes lurid experience in the days before cinema. These paintings were made at a monumental scale, but they were meant to be portable. And here you see Raleigh's panorama hanging in the New Bedford Masonic Building in 1904. They were often made like theater backdrops on loose canvas painted with tempera paint. And sometimes it was scene painters who worked for local theaters that actually painted panoramas. These paintings traveled the country, some crossed oceans, and were incredibly exciting events. Everyone wanted to see a panorama. Moving panoramas, like the Russell Purrington example, traveled on rolls and moved like a movie. Static panoramas, like Raleigh's, were often hung around an assembly room, like you see here, and did not move. Today, panorama paintings are extraordinarily rare. There are only 8 known panorama paintings held in U.S. public collections, and this museum houses 2. Now, after being publicly exhibited until at least 1905, Raleigh's panorama was donated in 1918 on a single canvas roll to the New Bedford Whaling Museum. In 1958, the museum decided to undertake a massive conservation project. It cut the panorama into 79 by 141-foot sections, or roughly 6 feet by 12 feet. And between roughly 1960 and 1968, 17 of those panels were conserved by Boston area conservator Gustav Kleiman, who trimmed them, patched them, cleaned them, flattened them, and mounted them with wax adhesive onto heavy 1/8-inch aluminum panels that had been used for airline fabrication. And we'll hear a lot more about this. Now, the museum operated with the best of intentions for this project, and here you see 2 of the panels being hoisted by crane into Kleiman's Boston area studio. However, the practice left us with 17 paintings that each weighed well over 200 pounds, were massive, were hard to move around, were difficult to store, and were hard to hang. This led to the project that I mentioned, the exhibition project that aimed to underscore the challenges museums face in dealing with large collections and unusual objects. And here you see some of the images from conservation reports at the time that show the work done by Kleiman in his studio. So the exhibition A second goal was to raise funds for the conservation of the paintings and preserve them for generations to come. And in this, the exhibit was a true success, as today we're able to unveil the first panel, Conserved by Gianfranco Pocobene Studios. And as Gianfranco and Corinne Long will share this evening, the conservation of this painting was no small feat. As I understand it, this was the largest aluminum panel reversal ever undertaken, and it was a highly complex project. The conservation project was made possible through a major grant from the Save America's Treasures program, funded by the National Park Service in collaboration with the Institute of Museum and Library Services, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. So it's now my pleasure to introduce the first of our two speakers tonight, Gianfranco Pocobene, who holds a BA in Fine Art from McMaster University, an MA in Conservation Science from Queen's University, and an advanced certificate in Paintings Conservation from the Strauss Center for Conservation and Technical Studies at the Harvard Art Museums. Gianfranco has built an illustrious career as a paintings conservator in the Boston area, where he has served as a research conservator for the MFA Boston, as conservator of paintings at Harvard Art Museums, and as the John L. and Susan K. Gardner Chief Conservator at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. He is currently Chief Paintings and Research Conservator at the Gardner, where he is responsible for the conservation and restoration of the paintings collection, with emphasis on the technical research and related scholarly activities. He is also acting principal at Gianfranco Pocobene Studio in the Boston area, who was our partner on this project, and where he specializes in conservation of easel paintings. Gianfranco's resume includes an incredible number of impressive projects and specialties. A few, though, stand out in relation to our Panorama project that I want to highlight. He was project director of the restoration of the John Lafarge murals and decorations in Trinity Church in Boston, and was project supervisor of the conservation and restoration of John Singer Sargent's Triumph of Religion mural cycle at the Boston Public Library. More recently, Gianfranco's studio has made a specialty of treating and reversing aluminum sheet interleaves and panel mounting, with papers on this topic presented in international conferences, such as the American Institute for Conservation Annual Conference. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Gianfranco Pocobene, who will speak to us about this incredible project first, and then followed by Corinne Long.
Great, we're back to our slide. So thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I think the first thing Corinne and I want to say is to Naomi, congratulations on getting the funding to do it, because without that, we're not doing anything on this scale. So, you know, a big round of applause for you also. As Naomi mentioned, this is the largest panel reversal that we've done in the studio. And I'm going to basically set the stage for kind of the history of these treatments that were done, and kind of the complexity of, you know, the reversing some of these things. And you'll see some examples of smaller things that we've done over the last 5-6 years. I think it's been, about 6 years or so that we've been doing these. So without further ado, and actually Naomi gave a great introduction to the painting, and obviously this is an image of the painting before treatment. And I am just going to move along here. This is just an image we took actually when we came to see you back in early 2022, I guess it was. And ours, of course, is on the top left, or the one that we worked on, the first on the upper left. So as Naomi mentioned, Gustav Kleemann is actually an interesting figure in art conservation in the Boston area. And he and actually the other character who was doing this sort of thing, his name is Morton Bradley. And they had both kind of come out of the tradition at Harvard, the Fogg Art Museum. And the treatment that was carried out on this and a lot of other paintings, today we would consider very excessive and extreme. But we have to step back and look at the situation that in the 40s, 1950s, 1960s, well into the 70s, there was no climate control in museums. So often they were, museums were acquiring things that came from other parts of the world. And, you know, the change in climate meant that a lot of these objects became pretty unstable in our climate, which is very different from European climate or Asian climate, for example. So one of the things they were trying to do was to mount these canvases onto something that would sort of basically fix them to a surface, and they wouldn't respond so badly to the environment. And there are many examples actually going back, even at the Gardner Museum in the teens and the 20s, 19 teens, 1920s, where the wooden objects, because of the climate changes and the dry winters and very humid summers, panels would split. So things were not being, we're not in great condition because of the climate. Now with climate control, things have changed very, very much. So we're in a much better place. So it's easy to be critical about what they did in the past, but I think they were really trying to figure out ways to deal with these things. But in this case, I think Kleiman and his cohorts got a little kind of carried away with some of the materials and the weight of them. So just introducing the characters. So as Naomi said, we actually, Corinne and I came in January of 22 to see the exhibition and to discuss the possibilities. And it was a great, we spent a good hour or two just looking at all the paintings. And just to give you a sense of what's on the reverse, this is what they look like. This is actually the painting we worked out in our studio. And you can see it has these sections of aluminum and these brackets of, again, aluminum riveted on, and then this wooden framework. It looks like cedar, I think is what it is, sort of, that was holding the whole thing sort of steady on that, on the back of it. So what I want to do very quickly before Corinne goes into the details of what we did with the Raleigh painting is show you a couple of examples of smaller treatments that we did a number of years ago that kind of got us on this journey of dealing with these paintings. Now, there are several reasons why you might want to remove these canvases from these rigid aluminum supports. They could be the appearance of the objects. Basically, when they're mounted onto these surfaces, they get a very flat, almost placemat looking kind of look to them. They don't look like canvases anymore. Sometimes, and in the case of this painting by Morton Schamberg from the Rose Art Museum, the wax adhesive actually darkened the surface of the painting. And this was a painting that was going out on loan, and it was fixed pretty well to the aluminum. It wasn't coming off or anything. There wasn't any structural problem, but it had a very noticeable dark appearance to it because the wax kind of impregnated the canvas, and this is very thinly painted. So this is the painting before treatment, and this actually gives you a good idea of what they were up to. And what you can see here, this is the reverse of the painting. This is the original canvas here on this surface here. Here's this aluminum sheet that's been put in here. It goes all the way around. And on the back, they would mount another piece of fabric so it looked like a canvas painting, except it was like this very rigid kind of support. And what you see, this kind of yellow material here is the wax resin that was used to bond it. So it's on this side of the panel, but also on the other side where the original canvas is stuck to it. And so actually, this is an image of us taking the painting apart. And what we ended up doing with this, because it is wax, if you get up to the right temperature, which in this case typically is around 135, 140 degrees tops. You can warm up the back of the painting. In this case is what we did. And we're slowly starting to like lift off the canvas as the wax melts enough to just sort of release it. So on this scale, it's a pretty straightforward thing. Although actually this was our first one. And it was a situation where we thought, oh, let's just see how this goes, how easy it moves. And we just were finding it was coming off quite nicely, and we just kept going. So here it is on the table with weights. And then once we got half of it done, we flipped it around and did the other side. So here's the painting coming off the panel, or the aluminum. Here you see the aluminum sheet, and you can see it's a very thin fabric. And you can see it's got this kind of yellow, darkened kind of look to it. That's the wax that's penetrated all into the back of the canvas. So the canvas isn't just like a canvas painting that you would typically associate with a painting from this period. And here again, you see the back of the painting and how darkened the fabric is. And actually, this is Corinne actually doing the treatment here. And what we're doing here is removing the wax from the surface of the painting, which had penetrated right through. So we're using mineral spirits and other kind of hydrocarbon solvents to dissolve the wax, making sure it doesn't do anything to the actual painting. And then this is an image on the left before treatment, on the right after treatment. And you can just see the difference in terms of the luminosity that is required. So in this case, it wasn't that there was a structural problem with the painting. It was about improving it aesthetically because of the darkening that had occurred to the painting. The next painting I wanted to show you is this one of these paintings by Hyman Bloom. There was a great retrospective of his a couple of years ago at the MFA. I hope you had the chance to see it. And he does these really fantastic images. In this case, this is a larger painting. This is getting over 4.5 feet high by about 3 feet wide. And the client, again, it had this kind of very placemat kind of look to it or feel to it. And there were issues with, again, with some of the adhesion between the original fabric and the aluminum that it was on. And in this case, you see Corinne on the right and Courtney, who's now at the St. Louis Art Museum. Here we are. In this case, it really released very easily again. And what's nice about this situation is what you want to do is be able to keep the painting flat as much as possible and actually kind of roll off the aluminum. Because if you start, in this case, this painting actually had very thick paint on it. And what you don't want to do is distort the painting because then you crack it, you can cause all sorts of problems. So the ideal situation is to be able to do this where you leave the painting, the canvas flat on a surface like this, and you just basically peel back the aluminum. And again, here, then it was a question of going through the removal of the wax. This is from the reverse. And this is actually Corinne's hands here. She's doing it. And, you know, you can warm the wax up, and you'll see with the Raleigh how we did that. But you can see basically this just sludge of wax that's on the back of the painting that you have to remove first mechanically. And then again, the whole surface is cleared again with more solvents to get it, you know, get as much of the wax off as you can. You can't get 100% of it off, but if you get 95% or more, then that what allows you to do is to do what's called a lining. And we have examples, again, of images I'm not going to get into here of how that's done in terms of attaching now a new fabric to the reverse of the painting. So this is a stretcher in this case, which was also what we did with the Raleigh. And this basically turns it back into kind of the painting that it was originally, which was a painting on canvas stretched over a stretcher. So a much more pleasing and again, lightweight kind of situation with the painting. So I just want to do that quick intro, and Corinne actually is going to go through the whole treatment. I'm going to give a brief introduction to Corinne. So Corinne graduated a couple of years ago from Queen's University. She got her master's in conservation, and before that, she got her BA in art history at University of New Hampshire. And she's also a ceramic artist and very talented. And before she actually went to Queen's, she worked with me several years, like we all, when I was young too, trying to figure out what we're going to do with our lives. And she actually decided to get into conservation and did her chemistry. And then she's returned back to the studio to work with me. And I couldn't be more happier to have such a great colleague to do the work that we're doing. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Corinne, and she can go through the numerous steps that we went through to get the Raleigh painting to the state that it's in now.
Thanks, Gianfranco. We've actually been working together for over 10 years now, which seems crazy. So yeah, let's see. So the whole objective of this treatment was to take it off the aluminum panel that it was on to reduce the weight and the quality of the surface, make it look like an actual easel painting again. Not that it ever was, but that it had some life and movement, and also to clean the surface of the sort of yellowed surface coating. It could either be a varnish or some of that wax that had impregnated the front, and also old retouchings that were on the front. So to start off, any treatment we do, we always do a whole examination of the painting. See if there's any cracking paint, lifting paint, like fragility anywhere. See, in this case, see if the edges, how the edges would separate from the aluminum. And then we go ahead with testing, small little test areas. These were probably 2 inches or so wide, 2 by 2. And we try a range of solvents in solvent mixtures, and sometimes we'll gel the solvent to see if that works. And here are some of the solvent tests that we did. You can see my swab up there. It has a bit of blue, and that's testing to see what whether the overpaint could be removed, and then also the surface coating. We want to see whether the solvent we use is disturbing the original paint at all, which it shouldn't, and how quickly and efficiently it can remove the surface grime or whatever we're trying to remove. Here are some more examples of before or during, before and after shots of the clean surface and the dirty surface. So let me go back here. I was using a free solvent. So that's just an alcohol. We used an alcohol and an aromatic. So I think it was ethanol and like odorless mineral spirits. And we used that combination because it had a wax component and also a resin component. So the wax was attracted to the OMS and the resin component would be attracted to the alcohol. And we had a lot of discussions about how we wanted to proceed with this whole treatment, and we decided to first clean the surface and remove as much of that surface wax and overpaint, hoping that it might also help us to separate it from the panel in the future if we can weaken the bond through solvents through the front. So the other approach that we used was using solvent gels. So it's just adding a gelifier to the free solvent that I had shown previously. And with this, it helps keep the solvent on the surface of the paint so you have more dwell time. You can like leave it on there for 30 seconds. I think we went for a minute long, and let that solvent do its action. And then you can take your brush and gently agitate the surface, move around the gel, and lift off some of that overpaint and some of that varnish, and then remove it with a swab, and you have these nice clean surfaces. Here we have our interns, Catherine Hernandez and Christy Grattini, doing some of the work with us over the summer. You can see Christy's swab on the top she's using to clean the surface. You can also see how yellow it is on the left compared to that middle section that we're working on. And this is a during cleaning shot. On the left, it is clean. And on the right, it's yellowed. And if you can see in the image, a lot of the scuffs and scarring has been in-painted in the past. And that in-painting has turned different colors and is now a little bit too dark or a little bit just mismatched. And the more you look at it, the more you can see it. And on the left, you can sort of start to see some of the scarring be more apparent because it doesn't have that overpaint anymore. I can point some of these things. So this is, we've transitioned into the separation phase of the project. And I really don't think we could have even done this project so successfully if we hadn't had all that experience with the other aluminum panels, because it was a hybrid treatment with everything. Sort of like that first small painting that Gianfranco showed you, we were able to separate it by removing the canvas from the aluminum, rather than the second one that he showed you where you remove the aluminum from the canvas. And now the aluminum here was extremely thick, very heavy. There's no way we could have removed that from the canvas in any way. So we knew our approach was going to have to be to manipulate the original canvas surface. And when we had cleaned the surface, it had weakened the bond between the aluminum and the canvas. By removing a lot of the wax that had migrated to the surface, you also removed it between the two layers. So there was less of a bond. And here I am testing the corners to see how much it would separate using tension and experience and without bending too much or the surface of the paint. And also I should say, all these removals are really a case-by-case scenario. We couldn't have done this process if the paint was thick or if it was just purely oil paint. We did take some samples. I'm not sure if we don't have confirmation of the paint yet, but it has some oil component, but it's still very flexible. So essentially we removed it by separating all of the edges as far as we could. At a certain point, you can't get enough leverage to keep it all stable in this manner by pulling the corners up. So we lifted the corners and the edges, and then we took a sonotube, an 18-inch diameter sonotube that was wrapped in Dartec or like a plastic. And we used that to roll the painting onto as we separated it from the aluminum. And the gentle curve of the sonotube held the paint so that it wasn't being aggressively bent. And it was a stable angle the whole time. Here is the sonotube at the end of the panel, and also the amount of wax that was left on the back of the panel. So once it was separated, we still had to remove a bunch of wax resin from the back of the canvas. And that process can be done either using heat to soften the adhesive or a solvent, and also both. So here I'm using it's called a Pell hot air pen, and it's this cool little pen where you can control the heat, the temperature, and the air pressure. So it's about this big, and so I can do like little spot areas and get those areas. I can set the temperature to a specific one. I think I went to like 125, so it would soften the wax, but not melt it. So once it became soft, I took a micro spatula and was able to scrape it off the surface to remove the bulk of the wax resin. Here's a picture on the top. Here, this area right here, I have cleaned. I've removed the wax resin, and you can tell a bit that it's more matte and less shiny and a lighter color. Once I removed the bulk of the wax mechanically, I took a mixture of OMS and xylene to remove any wax that was impregnated in the fibers. So that's another solvent. And here I am. Sometime to get to the center of the painting, I had to sit on the painting with a cushion, of course, under me. And again, you couldn't work on something like this if it was thick paint or in any way. Once I had removed all the wax, we went into the process of lining it. So when you line a painting, you're adhering a canvas to something else. In this case, most typically, we're attaching it to another canvas rather than an aluminum panel. So we use an adhesive called BIVA, stands for Berger's ethylene vinyl acetate, and it's a heat sensitive adhesive, and it also has a bit of a wax component. So we knew that this was the product that we were going to use because some of the wax is going to be unable to be removed from the canvas. So there's a little bit of wax still left in the canvas, and so the wax that is in the adhesive would bond to that. And it's carried in a solvent. So Gianfranco here is applying the adhesive with a paint roller. He did a couple coats, and then after all the solvent evaporates, which we give it about 24 to 48 hours for that to happen, you are left with just the adhesive, which will melt at a temperature of around like 155. Next, we attached a new canvas to the back of it. And we tacked it down in certain areas before bringing it to the lining table so that we could actually transport it. So much of this process, you have to think about transport more than anything. So this is just being able to get from the floor to the lining table. We had to tack in certain areas. Now, once it's at the tack, this is our lining table, which is right here. And this is just a table extension that Gianfranco built so that the canvas could have something to lay on, the canvas that we were working on. So the canvas, the lining table is about 5 by 8, and it's a aluminum table with perforated top so that you can get air to suction through the table. And also it gets hot, so it can get up to around 200 degrees. But because it's smaller than the painting, we actually had to line it in 3 different sections. Here we are lining the first section. So as we line it, we unroll bits of the canvas, and then as it becomes lined, we move it to that table extension. The top image shows the painting just on the lining table with a plastic over top called Dartek. Dartek is just kind of like a stretchy plastic that can conform to the topography of the painting. Once you turn on the suction, you can see that it's gone from kind of like a loosey plastic to now it's taut because you have that suction pressure. And also we've raised the heat up to activate the adhesive and bond the 2 canvases together. So we repeated this whole process for the whole roll. We did this section and then the middle section and then the final section. Once it was lined, we went to the process of stretching it onto its new stretcher. And reinforcing the edges is important to us so that when you put tension, when you're stretching it, you have extra strength on that area that's going to be stapled and hold on. So we used polyester fabric as that barrier. Here we have placed the new stretcher on back of the canvas and just like are lining it up, and we always line it up and then we tack it in with some tacks around the edges to hold it in place. Once we're sure that we like the placement that everything is in, we will actually use our stretcher pliers and remove the tacks and replace them with staples. There we are, working happily. Gianfranco's smiling. Here's the back of the canvas after it's been stretched and lined. And the final phase is the aesthetic retouching phase. You can see in some of the images, and I'll show you more, there were a lot of scratches and tiny little areas of paint loss throughout the whole painting, and we color matched with stable pigments called Gamblin conservation colors. And they won't yellow over time, and you can get a really close match to the original paint. And we went in with tiny little brushes and just matched the areas of loss to the original surrounding paint color. Once all the in-painting was done, we applied a stable synthetic varnish. This is me spraying that on. Spraying it is the better way you don't want to brush it, because if you brush, you could risk lifting up any in-painting that you've done before. So it's best if we sprayed it on to even out the sheen and protect it from dust and grime that can land on it on the surface. This is like a before and after of the same area of the painting. This is during cleaning, but you can see the side right here is just before treatment, and over here how much brighter it has gotten. And all these little areas of loss have been toned and painted. This is a before picture and the after of the same area. I don't hear any oohs or ahs, but that's okay. That's all right. And here are the same 2 images just next to each other. So you can see the combination of yellowed surface coating and discolored overpaint in these sections in the sky and over here, how you can't even see that anymore. And here is the final after treatment photo of the beautiful painting. Voila. And with that, we want to say thank you and open it up to any questions. And of course, they're not here, but we couldn't have done this without the work from the rest of our team, Lauren Cardula, Christy Gertini, and Catherine Hernandez. All right, I'll go for you in the front.
Could we just do it in a microphone so we
Sure,
can
yeah,
pick it
yeah.
up on the recording? Thank you.
How long did the entire process take from the beginning to what we just saw?
Yeah, so actually we did log every hour because this is a pilot project. We were curious how long it would take, and it tallied up to 380 hours. Yeah.
Could you hazard a guess as to what portion of the world's art has been compromised by either saviors or circumstance?
No, I can't. Marco, what do you think?
So that's a great question. I mean, some of the worst things that have been done to paintings or works of art is by humans, like trying to do some, it's, and
Oh,
again, it's not that it's, intentional, but it is an issue. I mean, I think the great thing about this painting was that in spite of the fact of what was done to it, with the exception of the creases that were on the surface, which a lot of it actually had to do with it being rolled up and unrolled and displayed. It's actually in really great condition given its age and what it went through. So it varies a lot. Some things get, and this isn't so bad. I mean, there are a lot of paintings where the paint is very sensitive, and just with the solvents that Corinne was describing, you could easily just strip the surface off the painting like in seconds, and it's gone. You can't, you're not going to get it back. So
The materials that we use now are we are much better than what they were once. Any in painting that I do can be easily removed by someone in the future with pretty mild solvents. Whereas sometimes we come across things that have been retouched using oil paints, and then you can't remove that, so I think we're doing better.
We have a question from home. Catherine is asking what type of wood in the stretchers, and do you seal the wood stretchers?
Our stretchers are from Upper Canada. I'm assuming it's a softwood. Yeah. And we didn't seal them. We have a separation between the canvas, the original, and we have the lining fabric in between. So there's a barrier for any like acid migration in that way. Anything else? We've also put a very nice backing board system on the back of it. Coroplast. All right, another one.
Question. So is it on display behind us, or is that just a copy?
Yeah, that's the painting back here. So you can all go and get a nice look at it. Yeah, in person. Yeah, I think we think it weighs about 60 pounds now. Yeah, you can lift it.
From the several hundred pounds.
Yeah.
It took 4 people to move it. I mean, you couldn't 2 people down. I mean,
Yeah.
He would know better, but it's
Oh.
a real bear to move. So yeah, so it was really heavy to move, and you needed several people to move it. Never mind trying to get it up on a wall or anything, but it must be down to about 60 pounds or so maximum in terms of weight. We were moving it around and walking around.
Yeah,
it.
and then we had the discussion between like in aluminum, there's aluminum options for stretchers. There's also wood stretchers. We went with the wood stretcher because you can get a 3-inch thick stretcher bar. It was just a little bit more substantial in that way. And also you can the aluminum panels are a little bit tough to stretch large paintings because they put the wood on you can only staple it on the back. And on the wood stretchers, you can staple it on the edges of the tacking margin. So your tension, the way that when you're pulling to stretch it, you get a lot more pull.
And actually, there was very little, I mean, we stretched it and then there was just a little bit of keying out. There the wooden wedges that go in the corners just to give it the right tension so that it, it's nice and taut, but still looks like a canvas painting. Yeah.
Assuming that this painting that you've now done is kept in a controlled environment, how long is it likely to be stable in its current condition?
So Corinne described actually the pigments, which are in a really, really stable resin. And, there's an interesting history of when, again, because we're at the time we're at, 100 years ago, all you had options for was using like watercolor or oil or casein. The watercolors doesn't really go well with a lot of paintings, but oil was typically used. And so as it hardens and gets darker over time, it's really difficult to remove. So the resins that are used for the pigments now that we use, and they're specifically for conservation, they're not art, pigments. Those pigments, we're looking at least 75 to 100 years. Should be stable.
Potentially even more.
Even more. We don't know because we're not there yet. But what we do is in conservation, there's a lot of research and they do what's called accelerated aging. So they'll expose samples of these materials, whether it's pigments or the binder, the resin that holds it. They just blast it with a lot of light and sort of like do it all in a short period of time and you're trying to mimic 100 years or whatever it is. And then the varnish that you saw Corinne spraying on, it's called acryloid B72, and that actually has been around since the late 1960s. So it has a long track record. We've already been using it for about 70 years. And that is what's called a class A. It's like there's nothing better. And again, with that material, you're looking at 100 years or more before it even would start to degrade. It won't yellow. So in a museum environment, you're looking at well over 100 years. And one of the things about conservation treatments is you don't want to be doing them every 5 or 10 years. Because all the things that Corinne described to you, when you're on there with solvents and a swab, there's always risk of doing damage. It's just the nature of the work. I mean, you're exposing it to something that it shouldn't be exposed to. So our aim is to use materials that have a long life so that the next intervention is a long way off. I'll certainly be gone before this is, you might still.
Yeah,
I don't know,
and I think the only
Yeah,
thing that
yeah.
could happen is it may need to be keyed out again in the future or
Yeah.
restretched because the only thing, but even with that, because we put the poly strip around the edges of where we were stapling, that even won't pull really because it's a synthetic material.
But that bond between the original fabric and the linen that's on the back of it is a pretty stable. It's locked together. It's not going to really do much of anything over time. The only thing would be if you expose it to a lot of heat all of a sudden, or it got really cold. But again, we're in a
Barring
museum
natural
environment.
disaster.
Yeah, well, we can't control disasters, but in a museum environment, 100 years should be quite possible easily. I mean, there shouldn't be any reason why it shouldn't get that point. So it's a great thing if we can extend the life of the actual treatment.
We have a few more questions from the audience at home. One question from Cecilia. I'm not sure what the plastic was when you were adding the lining. Can you explain that part again?
Sure. So I think that's the Dartex that I was describing. So when I was describing the vacuum table, it is an aluminum top with holes that suck air through. And that is a really good amount of suction pressure. What would make it even better is if you had something on top of it to lock the air in. So we use the Dartex, the plastic over the surface of the painting to put pressure on the surface of the painting. And it's a pretty stretchy material. So if the painting has any impasto on it, it will actually stretch with that and it won't like flatten any of the paint.
Yeah, which wasn't a problem with this painting because it's very thinly painted.
Mm-hmm.
But basically, yeah, it's just you're using that air suction, pull the air from between that Dartec lining plastic on top of it, and it's basically holding the two canvases that have the adhesive between them. Get to the right temperature. It's about 155 degrees. We get it up to that temperature. You hold it there, and that activates the adhesive, and then you leave it under pressure until it gets back down to room temperature. So basically, it's a heat set kind of.
It's
technique.
replacing irons. So in the past,
done
you would
irons,
use
yeah.
an iron to put pressure on the painting and to heat it up at the same time. But that has in the past ruined paintings by damaging or by flattening a lot of impasto.
Yeah, so this is introducing heat from the reverse, and you can control it. You can just say 150 degrees or whatever.
Yeah.
And the irons they were using in the past weren't like the irons we have now. We're talking about they were just like,
Which
you
is
know,
probably how it
10
was.
kilo pieces of iron that were heated up and
Yeah.
you'd go on the surface. And a lot of them were really good at doing it, and some of them weren't. And a lot of paintings, if you're ever in a museum and you're looking at paintings with a lot of impasto, a lot of brushwork and texture, sometimes you'll see what we call, it looks like a butte. It looks like the top of the peak of the paint has been just like flattened. And you'll even get depressions around it, kind of what we call molding. It's like so you can really do a lot of damage to the surface. But there's not much of that going on anymore. Really, we work with these these lining tables because they're very gentle in terms of the amount of pressure that's needed to bond the two fabrics together to support the painting.
Amy at home is asking what were particularly enjoyable or tedious parts of the treatment. And they also say 3 cheers from your colleagues in St. Louis.
Ah, hi, St. Louis.
St. Louis, yeah. Actually, you did an internship in St. Louis working
I
on
did,
their you
their
got-
panorama.
their panorama. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see. So I think one of my more enjoyable and one of the most tedious parts was the wax removal on the back. I find it like to be both things, and I think most people would look at that process and say it looks meticulous, and maybe that's what I like about it. But having like working in a small section and softening the wax and then scraping it off was just so satisfying. It was a really immediate like thing. You could see it. You could see the watch the wax like come off really quickly. So that I think was my favorite part. And even more tedious was probably some of the in painting because it's just a lot of blue.
Yeah, it's a lot of just similar colors. Tedious is like people always that because it's very. I mean, you saw Corinne just sitting there, and it's hours of doing that. But I think there's kind of a Zen kind of quality. You just get into it, and everything shuts off in terms of other concerns. But most of the things we do, we don't. I guess it's just who we are, or our characteristics of the people that get into the field. We don't consider most of the work tedious. We're actually very interested in pretty well all the facets, and a lot of it has to do really with also just problem solving. Like how do you deal with something on this scale rather than a painting that's only a couple of feet wide or whatever. So it's those challenges and thinking through the processes, because the real critical thing is once you start on something, you better be sure you're going down the right path. I mean, you can't sort of like, sometimes you can back out, but you've got to make sure that you've thought through all of that. And often we'll just spend like a lot of time talking, like literally talking, like, what if we do this? And what if this happens? So it's that kind of thing that we do constantly, which is really important because you just want to go down the right path with everything you're doing and critiquing our ideas, which is, again, a lot of fun and not tedious at all, actually. Yeah. It's really engaging.
We have one more question from folks at home. Catherine is asking if the canvas is cotton or linen, and will the fibers react to moisture?
So the original is cotton. It's like it's a fine, super fine, almost like muslin cotton. And then the fabric we use to line the painting is actually linen. And we chose that because it's a much stiffer material. It doesn't require as much tension to get it to go flat and hold the painting. We could have used cotton, but cotton, as you know, wearing your jeans and whatnot, it stretches more. So and with the bond between the two of them and the adhesive, it's a nice stiff enough surface. But there are lots of other things that we could have used. I mean, you can use sailcloth is another material that we would use on a really large painting, for example, because it's very thin, but it has what's called high tensile strength. It doesn't take much tension to get it taut on a stretcher, for example.
And
But yeah, there are a lot of options for us. We don't get necessarily tied into one
Right.
kind of material if we can avoid that.
right.
Yeah.
And I think moisture infiltration shouldn't be an issue. First of all, because of the beaver layer that we have in between the two canvases, and also the wax that is still remains in the canvas, that just you can't get that out of the fibers all the way. And then we also have a Coroplast backing, so if any area where water can come through, it shouldn't stay there.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, even if you had sort of an excess amount of moisture, it might distort the canvas a little bit, but that could easily be remedied. It's not like it's going to create much of a problem.
Great questions. Thank you
Yeah,
to
very good
everybody from home.
Any other
Now
questions?
Naomi
or-
has a question.
Yeah, fire away, yeah. Yeah, that's actually fascinating. It's hard to see it in slides, obviously, but again, because of the way it was used and it displayed, it had an active life, I guess is the best way to. It wasn't just an easel painting. It's on the wall. Nobody touches it. Nobody moves it for the longest time. It was something that was rolled up and moved to another location and unrolled and positioned on the wall in very different ways. And because that canvas is so fine, right from the get-go, it's not a very stiff support for the paint. So if you think of like your bed sheets, actually, they're easily creased. You get into bed and you get creases all over them. It has that quality. It's a little thicker than a bed sheet, but it undergoes the same sort of thing. So when it's being rolled up, you would get cockling, and you would get distortions on there, and then the weight of it sort of on top of each other created these really fine creases, which are pretty permanent because the paint is sort of in there, and to get them out is almost impossible. I mean, you really can't get them out. So basically those things were, if you get really close to the painting, you look at the topography of it, you'll see those slight distortions. And we didn't want to eliminate them because they're part of the history of the painting. That's what it is. That's what the object is, that it was used that way. So, we took the retouching, the in-painting of those damages and the creases and scratches to a pretty high level so that it has integrity in terms of an image. But the topography of the painting is still what it is. And that's not a bad thing. I mean, we don't want to make it look like it was made yesterday. So you're always balancing those two things of making it look aesthetically as pleasing as possible. And yet, I don't know if there any, but also retaining the fact that it is a 150-year-old painting or 200-year-old painting, whatever the case may be. So, yeah, it's an important balance to play in terms of how things look on the surface. But yeah, if you look really closely, you'll see slight undulations of the paint and these creases that
Or where the paint loss was.
where the paint loss was. Yeah, it was very thinly painted, but again, you could just keep going on and never stop, but that's not really, that's not viable for all sorts of reasons. Any other questions or? Oh, there's one more. Yeah. Oh, just like.
So I was just going to say for those in the room, we'll have an opportunity to go up and see the painting. We'll move the sash. And there are 3 more of the Raleigh Panorama paintings on view in other galleries of the museum. So if you come back, you can see those untreated paintings and get a sense of what they looked like. But for now, I do want to, I think, conclude this part of the program with our Zoom audience. And say a big thank you to Gianfranco and Corinne for their incredible work on this project, for bringing us home a beautiful painting, and for sharing some of their work tonight with us. So thank you.
Thank you.